Sorry for the lack of videos lately. After finishing up the comprehensive series on Russian military storage bases, I needed to take a break and I wasn't sure what to do next. But one thing a lot of people must be thinking about, and I've seen a lot of comments like this, with these huge fields of tanks and other vehicles just sitting out in the open, packed close together, that's one juicy target. Can Ukraine strike them? Just destroy hundreds of tanks in one strike? One major problem is how far away they are. Russia is the largest country in the world, and due to arms control treaties, most of these storage sites were built east of the Ural Mountains, which are roughly 2,000 kilometers, or 1,200 miles, from Ukraine. To put that in some context, even if the US gave Ukraine the Tomahawk cruise missile, it wouldn't even be able to reach most of those sites. However, we've seen videos and reports of Ukrainian drones striking Moscow, and factories, warehouses, and oil refineries deep into Russia, some surpassing the range that would be needed to reach the closer tank storage bases. So, can they do it? And just how much damage could they achieve? But first, real quick, a word from our sponsor making this video possible, Exter. One of the worst things that can happen to you is losing your wallet. Money aside, losing your ID, credit cards, and everything else is a nightmare to have to replace. It's funny actually, when I took this picture for the last time they were a sponsor, I completely forgot I put it in there and only randomly found it several days later. If I had only kept their Finder card in it, I would have been able to find it right away. It's slim, about the size of a credit card. You can make it ring audibly up to 300 feet away, or find it anywhere in the world on the Find My app on your iPhone or Apple device. But they have a ton of other real cool, useful, and slick-looking products as well, including their wallets, carrying 12 cards and cash, as well as a quick card access button for easy use. And if you've ever seen them before and thought about buying one, or you could just use a new wallet, right now is the perfect time to finally do so, because not only will you be getting the 10% off with my code, but you'll also get their Valentine's Day sale. That'll give you up to 40% off. Go to the link here, posted in the description, and use the code COVERTCABAL to take advantage of this special deal. Again, Exter. Now, there's a ton of storage bases in Russia, but a lot of them just contain things like trucks or other support vehicles. So to keep things simple, we'll just use the 9 central tank storage bases. These are the deep, long-term storage bases that hold primarily tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, etc. And again, here's our latest count from the number of tanks and other armored fighting vehicles at each one of those bases at the end of last year. All numbers come from satellite imagery that I purchased and dated between September and November 2024, so much newer than you'll normally find on Google. But of these sites, most again are too far away for any realistic strike, unless somehow Ukraine got a sabotage team in physically. More on that later. Only 3 of these are within 3,000 kilometers of Ukraine: the 22nd, 1311th, and 6018th. The 22nd is the closer, just under 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine's border. However, directly along the path is Moscow, an area obviously with a lot more air defenses, radars, etc., meaning the chance of any attack being detected and intercepted is much greater. The other are close together, but twice as far away, 1,800 kilometers. Despite that, the area along the path is less densely populated, and if we look at a terrain map, we'll see that there are more hills and terrain to help mask your approach all the way up to the target. But still, those are likely too far away to be reached. There's been a lot of claimed Ukrainian strikes at extreme ranges, but few verified. Not every fire or explosion at a factory or oil refinery is from a drone. One of the longer, verified drone strikes was in April 2024, when what appears to be a A-22 Foxbat struck a factory at about 1,200 kilometers from Ukraine's border. The A-22 are ultralight manned airplanes, so not a purpose-built drone at all. It's just been stripped down, getting rid of the things like the cockpit that it doesn't need since it's unmanned, all just to make it as light as possible to increase the range. But that again is long enough to reach the 22nd Central Tank Storage Base. The question is, what kind of damage could they do? In order to fly that far, these drones tend to have really small warheads. It's a trade-off. The larger the warhead, the less fuel it can carry, meaning shorter range. We've seen Ukraine strike things like oil refineries and the massive fires that result. But that's obviously because it's filled with oil. All of Ukraine's long-range drones carry warheads less than 50 kilograms, and many even less than 10. Put that in comparison with most long-range cruise missiles like Tomahawk or the KH-101 that carry closer to 500 kilogram warheads. That A-22 is the exception. We don't know for sure, but assuming they saved weight on removing the cockpit and replacing it with computer guidance, and then added some extra fuel, maybe at most a warhead of 100 kilograms if flying over 1,000 kilometers. But it's also important to note that they likely don't have very many of those. They're actually made by a Ukrainian company. The company claimed that they produced over 1,500 in the last 20 years that it's been in production, but most would have been sold to customers. And with the war going on, it's likely to affect production as well. But to put things in perspective, a Javelin missile has just over an 8 kilogram warhead. So realistically, the vast number of Ukrainian long-range drones won't inflict much damage on multiple vehicles. Then the M31 GMLRS, fired from things like HIMARS, has a 91 kilogram warhead. What also is going to matter is the type of warhead. There's many types, but for our purposes, if you want to destroy multiple vehicles at a time, generally an airburst would be much more suitable. Doing so spreads out the damage over a wider area. Things like the M30 GMLRS with submunitions, or the M30A1 alternative warhead GMLRS they replaced it with. These will detonate roughly a dozen meters above the ground, spraying out over 180,000 individual tungsten fragments, which just rip through things like vehicles. The damage shown here from a test doesn't look all that bad, but these pierced through things like the engines and other components, not to mention anyone inside, rendering the vehicle unusable and not easily fixable without just replacing the entire engine, etc. This, though, is obviously against a truck, not a heavily armored tank. These images are reportedly of a Russian Tor air defense system that was hit by this M30A1. I'm not confident on that though. But it does have more armor than a civilian truck, which means it would be a viable weapon and warhead to use against some lighter armored vehicles, like BTRs and possibly BMPs. And in fact, tests conducted in the late 80s by the US found that 155mm artillery rounds, weighing less than half that, about 43 kilograms, did significantly more damage than they originally thought. Their model predicted just 30% damage overall, but the test resulted in 67%. They found rounds that impacted within 30 meters caused considerable damage, and airburst rounds as well caused major damage to weaker points like sights, where the barrel connects to the turret, even engines, the tracks, the wheels, and anything connected outside the vehicle. However, it's important to note that artillery rounds in the GMLRS benefit from their extra kinetic energy due to their speed, unlike that of the A-22, which flies roughly 10 times slower. So, the main central tank storage bases are mostly out of the question just due to their distance and limited size of warheads that Ukraine can deliver that far. But there are, in quotes, storage bases much closer. Things like the 7024th, which I originally counted, but since has turned more into a depot for vehicles going in and out of Ukraine. It's less than 200 kilometers from the front line, which puts it in range of things like Storm Shadow and ATACMS that the West has given Ukraine that have much larger warheads, both closer to 500 kilograms. This site has always been just full of vehicles and a lot of activity. The problem is the latest image on Google is from mid-2022, and a lot has changed since. So I bought this much newer image from September 2024 to see what things look like more recently, and how Russia might have taken into account things like these Storm Shadows and ATACMS. The first thing that stands out is how all vehicles, besides some trucks, seem to be systematically spread out. Where vehicles were packed tightly together before, now they're spaced apart. And there's a clear pattern to it, so it's obviously intentional. There's a few reasons that you might do this, like for easier access to all sides of the vehicle for maintenance, or more likely here, to minimize your losses in the event of an attack. If a weapon with a certain blast radius might be aimed at a location with 30 or 40 vehicles, now spread out, it'd only damage or destroy a fraction of that. So Russia has been adapting somewhat to new potential threats as the war progresses. Really, the only other method might be to physically send in a team to sabotage them, and we've seen somewhat similar things happen. This would be extremely tricky though. First of all, you're talking about dozens or even hundreds of vehicles that you'd have to each individually address. You'd have to get the team in there with a huge amount of explosives, and all these bases have security with many guard towers visible in satellite imagery. Then would be the issue of somehow sabotaging a tank. Again, these tanks don't have any fuel or ammo or anything that'll combust. The best option might be to place explosives in the barrels or engine components if they even have them. Basically any more vital spot that would be more difficult to replace or repair than just some holes in the armor. Then obviously set timers to give the team time to escape. As you can imagine, that would be unlikely to succeed, or even be of much value. After all these vehicles are in storage and they're going to be sent for repairs anyway before being used. So while these bases may seem like juicy targets, many of the vehicles there are little more than just metal hulls. That is until they're pulled from storage and overhauled. In the meantime, the limited number, range, and warhead capacity of drones Ukraine does have for deep strikes into Russia are put to better use against more valuable and more vulnerable targets, like oil refineries. But nevertheless, it's an interesting thought, and one that easily pops into people's mind when seeing all these tanks that Ukraine might have to fight against just sitting out there in the open.